Hello, I'm Jim Grant, welcoming you to a very special edition of Forum for a Better Understanding. Michelle Alexander, a legal scholar and law professor at Ohio State University, emphatically asserts that Ronald Reagan's fabricated war on drugs in the 1980s has blossomed into a well-disguised, comprehensive, and intentional system that she calls the new Jim Crow. According to Alexander, this system was created by the political elite, the media, and by the redirecting of public funds to law enforcement for policing the war on drugs. Claiming that this war on drugs is the new Jim Crow, she sees racial domination the real end and racial indifference as a primary cause. Citing statistics showing that blacks are now incarcerated 7 times as often as whites, she contends that the system of mass incarceration works to trap African Americans in a virtual and a literal cage. According to Alexander, the system is not broken, but instead doing just what it was designed to do. As she grimly concludes, if mass incarceration is considered a system of social control, specifically racial control, then the system is a fantastic success. This is a very difficult topic that we're dealing with again for the 3rd time, and I want to thank our guests for being here. I wonder if Dr. Karen Crozier and Dr. Ryan could please tell us why it is that they're here today talking about this and where they first learned of Michelle Alexander and her thesis on the new Jim Crow. Dr. Crozier.
Thank you, Jim, for this opportunity to be here today and to discuss this very important topic and impact that it's having not only on the African American community, but our nation as a whole. What brought me to Michelle Alexander's work was my work at Fresno Pacific University. It was with the Community Justice Conference with the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, and we had the opportunity to launch a pilot project back in 2009 to look at how we can give alternative responses to our young people who were ending up in the juvenile justice system. My concern was not only do we react to the crime that was done, but how can we look at broader systemic issues that impact our young people as well, and begin to look at the conditions that and the systems that led to them being in that particular predicament of a crime. In addition, Reverend Floyd Harris, he and I, along with Dr. Elizabeth Swearingen from Fresno State, were able to use the book back in 2010 for the Freedom School that we did, and we were all enthralled by the claims that she was making and began to do popular education for Fresno residents here in light of Michelle Alexander's claim, the new Jim Crow. Now, quickly, why am I here today? I believe that Christianity, biblically and theologically, has a lot to say to those who are socially and racially marginalized and controlled, as well as we are able to recover those aspects of our tradition that has been dismissed, as well as identify new ways in our hermeneutic and living of the gospel for today.
Thank you, Karen. Dr. Schellenburg, tell us a little bit about your work at Fresno Pacific, and specifically, what brought you here today?
Yes, I teach Bible at Fresno Pacific University, specifically focusing on Paul and the New Testament. And I actually encountered Michelle Alexander's book almost by accident. My wife brought it home one day, and I started reading it, and was amazed to find all kinds of analogies and parallels to the things that I study when I look at the New Testament. It's one of these instances where looking at contemporary situations and looking at the situation in early Christianity, I think we learn a lot from viewing these two things in common, or in the same conversation. So I'm excited to be here and participate in that conversation.
Which is exactly
today.
the first question we wanted to really delve into. As professors of biblical and religious studies, how do you think the Michelle Alexander's claim in the light of faith and race, how do you see that playing out? Ryan.
Yeah, I think I see two initial areas of interaction between my scholarship on Paul and early Christianity and Michelle Alexander's thesis. The one has to do with race and the fact that Christianity developed. The church really has its origins as an experiment in racial reconciliation. In the ancient world, there's this antipathy or hatred between Jews and Greeks. And yet Paul and other early Christian leaders insist that they have to get around the same table and eat together and overcome that. Ephesians talks about one new humanity that Christ births that takes away the enmity of the two groups in the past. And then so racial reconciliation. The other thing I've been thinking much about is the fact that early Christian experience was one of racially based criminalization in the context of Roman colonialism. Let me unpack that just a little bit. Jews in the ancient world were not well looked upon. To take their experience in the city of Rome as an example, on 2 occasions at least in the first century, many Jews were expelled from the city of Rome, often because there was one incident of crime that involved a Jew, and as a result, Jews were slandered. In short, I guess, if a Roman commits a crime, the mindset went, if a Roman commits a crime, that's one bad Roman. If a Jew commits a crime, then that's because they're an evil race. And of course, there we have eerie analogies to the situation in the contemporary United States. So these Christian Jews, and basically all Christians were Jews or associating with Jews by being Christians, they refused to stay in the place that Rome set out for Jews, and they proclaimed that it was Jesus who was the true emperor, not Caesar. And for that reason, they were criminalized.
Karen, in your work, how do you see this claim playing out in the light of faith and race?
Yes, Ryan raised a significant parallel between the system that exists today when an African American is automatically perceived as a criminal and how that impacts the whole race and not just that individual. And so in my reality of today and looking at Howard Thurman, who is a great mentor, and what he was able to identify in his groundbreaking text in 1949 called Jesus and the Disinherited, he was able to ask the pivotal question, what does Christianity have to say to those who have their backs up against the wall? And how can we begin to unpack the reality in which Christianity, in the ways that it was practiced in his day and in our day, that it doesn't really speak to those who are socially marginalized, who are racially marginalized and controlled. And so therefore, Thurman helps me to understand that Jesus, as a disinherited group of the Jews with which Ryan identified that happens during the Pauline era as well, was able to say Christianity does have something to say because he proclaimed, according to Thurman, Jesus proclaimed the gospel that the kingdom of God is within. So Caesar is not my emperor. Even though I'm an empire, there is a different father, a different king that I am submitting to in order to live out in a way that does not make me complicit to Rome, and it also frees me to live in a different way beyond the ways that Rome wants to keep me in my place as a mere second-class citizen as a Jew.
What's interesting is what you've said personally. I'm going to now, let's say, give it an upgrade and say, how are you informed by Alexander as teachers and scholars? First group, how does it work in your curriculum and your pedagogy? How was any of this reflected?
Well,
Karen.
I will begin with popular education, as I shared earlier with Reverend Harris as well as Dr. Swearingen, and then also peacemaking circles, which I do at Fresno Pacific University, where I invite not only professors, colleagues, students of mine, as well as the broader community, to be able to understand what the new Jim Crow is saying, Alexander's main thesis, and how do we grapple with it in our contemporary experience. So popular education is one way. Another way is in my leadership course, where I have the transfer scholar students at FPU who are coming in from previous academic experiences, and now they are perceived as leaders and given scholarships, and provide them with a context and a way to understand what does King, bringing in Martin Luther King Jr. in the King celebration that we just had this past January, how does his nonviolent direct action, ministry and vision for peace have to do for phenomena like the new Jim Crow today? So invite students to understand this reality that many of them were not aware of, but at the same time be exposed to it. And even though they come from backgrounds and contexts that is not African American or low income, they have the opportunity to sit with others in a learning community in order to understand what does this mean for me, and then when I go back to my more homogeneous context, how can I begin to think about how to live faithfully in a way that will speak to the reality of the new Jim Crow and the people that I am serving and leading in my particular context. And lastly, no, I will stop there. It just allow colleague Ryan.
In your curriculum, Ryan, how do you structure it so it reflects your own passion?
Yeah, let me give you just one example. This semester I'm teaching a course in Paul's prison letters. Of course, Paul wrote at least two of his most, of the letters that are in the New Testament from a prison context. And so in some ways I'm running the course as what I think of as an experiment in empathy, that I'm inviting students to empathize with Paul's situation, and also to empathize with the situation of prisoners in the contemporary world, and particularly in the contemporary United States. So I'm having them do research into ancient prisons to try to get a sense of what life was like in ancient prisons, and see how many startling similarities there are when we look at prisons in the United States today. And also to read, alongside Paul's letters from prison, also to read contemporary prison literature that expresses the experiences and realities of contemporary, those who are incarcerated today. And the goal there, I think, is to develop empathy, to begin to see just like Paul had this experience in prison, these contemporary people are having experiences that are in many ways similar. We read American prisoners as villains usually, and Paul as a hero. Oh, yeah. And I hope my students can see that both are human, first of all.
What kind of result are you seeing at all?
I see both resistance to the idea that empathy with prisoners is even a desirable thing. But I also do see people starting to connect with these prisoners' experiences, and certainly it's been provocative so far and engaging.
That's great. It sounds that way from the way you speak, that this is something you are finding meaningful for you as a professor, as a scholar,
yes,
and as an instructor.
Yeah.
Karen, could you unpack this, and then Ryan, your own research, how your findings and how your focus on research, where is that leading you?
Right. Well, my main component is looking at the intersection of faith, race, and the new Jim Crow. And so as Ryan was sharing earlier, as far as in his experiment of empathy within a college classroom, both my college classroom as well as beyond the college classroom, as I see myself as an educator, it is difficult for people on the ground to really engage conversations around race matters, and racial injustice, because we are perceived to be, quote unquote, in a post-racial context. And so therefore, it becomes something for me as a professor, as an educator, to understand the different dynamics and how to help people to reflect upon who they are in their own social location around race, around gender, around class, and to begin to under prisoner versus non-prisoner, villainizing one today and making one out of hero of yesterday, but how do we begin to see our own humanity in that process? Another thing that Faith, Race, and the New Jim Crow raises is that is a need for a more robust theology and ethic in light of the comprehensive impact. Because as Ryan has identified, we have these Christian communities that were present and were being impacted by the system of Rome and the Roman Empire, but yet they were responding. They were not backing away from how they understood Jesus to be the Christ. And how Christians today, how can we be sensitive to those people if we're not, excuse me, how can we be sensitive to those who find their backs up against a wall in a way to say, I care for you too, as well for the system that is dehumanizing you in that process.
We have to take our break right now, but we'll be right back, and we'll let Dr. Schellenburg weigh in on his own research and findings in this area. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Dr. Schellenburg, your classes sound fascinating. They really do, this effort of getting students engaged. In your own research, where is that taking you personally?
I guess two things that are relevant to this topic. The one is this historical puzzle of why Paul kept ending up in prison, which is something that scholarship on Paul really hasn't dug into very carefully. We know why Paul thinks he's in prison, right? He says, I'm in prison because because of the Lord, because of his belief in Christ. But what would the Roman magistrate who threw Paul in prison think that he was doing by putting Paul in prison? This is something that scholarship hasn't worked hard enough on, I think, and I'm trying to press this issue and see how race might play into it. The other thing I'm interested in is what I think is a forgotten tradition of care for prisoners in early Christianity. Hebrews commands Christians to care for, or to be compassionate toward prisons as if you were in prison with them. There's that development of empathy again, right? And that spawns this whole tradition of care for prisoners. It's reflected in many patristic texts. At one point, a 2nd century Greek author by the name of Lucian, he makes fun of Christians for spending so much time and energy going to prisons to look after their leaders who are imprisoned. So obviously they're notorious by this point for going into prisons and caring for those who are in prison.
Karen, one thing to bring you back about your efforts at analysis of scholarship and integration. You've got an upcoming conference. What's that all about?
Right. The University of British Columbia in Canada is hosting their 12th annual diversity conference in organizations, communities, and nations, and I was accepted to present on the new Jim Crow. And I will be sharing my analysis of how I have engaged as a person of color to raise consciousness within my particular institutional context and how that has led to my ethic. And one of the things that I will be focusing on is the topic is redeeming racism and other isms. And I want to draw upon Paul from Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, when he says it this way from the NRSV. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. And so one of the things that I have really learned in this process, that the social and political reality of race as a scientific fallacy, I must die to. That's not a game, but I also must name the reality in which it plays out in our world towards that new humanity in which I say Christ calls us to. Mm-hmm. So there's a deepening suffering that is taking place as I am being transformed in this process of looking at the ways that race matters impact us and the ways that our country and even our city are not really ready to name the reality in which race is a power that destroys, that negates life.
Getting back to you as a professor, Doctor, what are your hopes for your students and for Christian higher education in general in the light of the new Jim Crow? Are you hopeful?
I am. I've mentioned the word empathy, I think, probably a number of times already, and that's really
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's one of my main goals as a teacher in general, and particularly on this issue, is my hope would be that students develop empathy, that it becomes contagious. I am optimistic that unjust institutions cannot survive an outbreak of empathy. So I'm hoping that in the classroom I can at least plant the seeds of that kind of outbreak of empathy.
And there are so many institutions that are needing to be empathized.
Yes.
And that would be maybe the only way. Karen, what about your students in so many different settings? How are they getting it?
My main thing is similar to what Ryan has shared, that the empathetic impulse that's in the DNA of Christianity, that we will see that has something to say to those who are being racially and socially controlled. It's not just merely trying to come and be, excuse me, it's not merely just trying to come and say, I have something to tell you as a Christian.
Oh, yeah.
But no, we're entering in with, suffering with, as if you were there or as if Christ was there. And so it gives us a whole new frame of mind as we see our Christianity in caring for those who are, as the Lucan narrative shares with us, in the highways and the byways, way far away from the center, but Christ cares about them and invited them to his banquet table.
Ryan, we talked about you with your hope for your students. Now I'll broaden it. What about the hope for Christianity as a faith, politics, and moral ethics? What are your hope for these institutions in the light of the new Jim Crow? Is there hope there too?
Karen just mentioned this wonderful text from the Gospel of Luke of going out to the highways and byways and everybody being invited to this banqueting table. I think my hope for the church would be that we are able to recover this tradition that makes a place for everyone at the table, go back to our roots and find there a foundation for racial reconciliation, find there a foundation for compassion and empathy and the ability to see everyone as humans, regardless of their race or regardless of what we would consider a criminal background.
You know, we've talked a lot about you as professors and have kind of like located you in a research mode or in a professorship mode. Let's take it out of there and say, what hope do you have for those not engaged in college or university studies? How could we, in other settings, be engaged in the new Jim Crow? Ryan, could you start with some ideas?
Yeah. I think regardless of whether or not one is in a university setting, one is able to look for what I think of as communities of education or communities of learning. That can be a church group, that can be a book study, that can be a group of friends gathering to process these issues, to talk about these issues. So I would want to invite people to read Alexander's book, read prison literature as I'm inviting my students to do. Maybe start a correspondence relationship with someone who's in prison. Develop a relationship with someone in prison. There are a number of ways to get in touch with prisoners and start these relationships, which will surely begin to develop in you the seeds of empathy.
You know, there are some references you gave us that we could maybe post. Tell us something about Bruce Franklin and the prison writing in the 20th century.
Yeah, I have a book here that I'm using as a textbook in my course. It's called Prison Writings in 20th Century America, and is a collection of a number, Malcolm X is in here, Kate Richardson, who was a prison reformer early in the 20th century, and a whole range of other writers writing about and from their experiences in prison. It's a fascinating resource, startling and difficult to read at times, but certainly worth diving into.
What about the resource called realcostofprisons.org?
Yeah, this is a website that, again, posts writings from people who are currently serving time in prisons in the United States, and includes their contact information. So if you want to write a prisoner, that's a great place to start.
And Journal of Prisoners on Prison.
Yeah, it's a journal started by a number of academics who want to have prisoners writing about prisons, not just criminologists from the outside writing about prisons. It's a fascinating place to start as well.
Thank you for all these resources and for sharing your passion for getting into Paul on a different level. This is very, very exciting what you've shared. Karen, where do you see a way to really engage the people not in the academic setting?
Well, as Ryan has indicated, as far as the learning communities, and one particular learning community that I'm a part of is within the juvenile justice campus of doing peacemaking circles with the youth, female and male, who are present there as we reflect upon why they are there and hearing their narratives and stories of what they can do to resolve and take the next steps. So I am learning from them as I am in empathetic relationship with them as we meet there every Tuesday night at 6 o'clock.
Where do you meet?
At the Juvenile Justice Campus on American and 99.
Who's there?
Who's there? There's anywhere from 10 to 15 young ladies from 6 to 7 who show up on a consistent basis, as a volunteer basis, and the staff participates as they desire. No one is mandated to participate because we are volunteers. My brothers are Salvador Bueno Jr. and Robert De La Torre. We partner together in order to engage in a learning process with our little sisters and brothers in ways that try to show forth the authenticity of what Christianity has to say, as well as deepening our understanding of our own faith as we continue to live this out.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Ryan Schellenburg and the Reverend Dr. Karen Crozier, who have shared with us today a conversation on the new Jim Crow from Biblical and Theological Perspective. I hope you'll join us again next week when another panel will be here to take up that topic on faith, race, and the new Jim Crow from ministry perspectives. We hope you're enjoying this very challenging topic and that you will do some of the things that we have asked you to read, to get committed, and to become engaged. Till next week, God bless.